As the night finally settled and the last of the grandchildren curled up on the couch with Coco, she stood quietly in the glow of the tree they had decorated together, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in far too long, a warmth not just from the lights, but from being seen, heard, and valued again. It reminded her how easily love can get tangled in busy lives, how quickly respect can fade when unspoken expectations replace honest conversations, and how deeply a mother's heart can bruise when she's treated like an obligation instead of a blessing. Yet it also reminded her that healing is possible, that families can grow up just as they grow older, and that sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage, one moment of finally saying enough to make people remember who you are and what you mean to their lives. And maybe you felt something like that too, that quiet ache of being taken for granted or overlooked or assumed to be endlessly available simply because you've always been strong. So before we end this story, I want to ask you gently, with all the softness your heart deserves, have you ever had a moment when you finally stood up for yourself and it changed the way your family treated you? If you feel comfortable, share your story below. Your voice might be the reminder someone else needs tonight that they are worthy of respect, no matter their age. She stood there in her quiet living room long after the whispered words behind the hallway had stopped, long after her children walked out her front door with cheerful goodbyes she now knew were painted over dishonesty, and she felt something in her chest she couldn't even name at first, something heavier than sadness, deeper than betrayal, more exhausting than anger. It was the kind of ache that only comes from realizing that you've spent decades giving love freely, generously, wholeheartedly, only to discover that the people you gave it to now see you not as a person to cherish, but as a resource to use. She placed the ornament box on the floor and sank slowly into her favorite armchair, the one her late husband used to tease her about, your throne, he'd call it, with a soft kiss on her forehead. And as she sat there, surrounded by the half-lit decorations she had put up with such hopeful anticipation, she felt each whispered sentence replaying in her mind like echoes in an empty house. Mom can watch all the kids. She'll be fine. She has nothing else to do. She owes us. Don't tell her she'll say no. Every word sliced deeper than the last, not because they intended cruelty, but because they never even considered the weight of their words on her aging heart. That thought alone was almost worse, that they didn't even consider her feelings enough to soften their tone, to ask, to wonder if maybe she had dreams of her own, or plans, or even limitations. They didn't see her tired shoulders when she carried laundry up the stairs, or how she rubbed her knees quietly after a long day, or how she gripped the rail when stepping down from the porch. They didn't see the way she held her breath sometimes, waiting for her body to catch up with her mind. They didn't see her humanity. They saw help, free help, automatic help, help they didn't think they needed to respect. She let her eyes drift to the twinkling lights wrapped around the Christmas tree, some blinking gently, others still dark because she hadn't finished checking the bulbs yet. Decorating the tree without her husband had always been the hardest part of the holidays, but she did it every year because it kept a piece of him alive. The way he'd hum off-key carols, the way he'd fuss over making the star perfectly straight, the way he'd lean back and admire the tree with pride like he'd grown it himself. She missed that, she missed him. And maybe, she thought painfully, that was why her children assumed she'd take all 8 grandkids without question, because they didn't know how lonely the house felt without him. They didn't know how much strength it took for her to hold herself together on the holidays, how sometimes the silence in the evenings felt too loud to bear, and how she would sit in this very armchair and whisper to the empty room. I hope they need me tomorrow. Not for babysitting, not for errands, but for company, for conversation, for something that made her feel like she was still part of the living heartbeat of the family. But now she saw the cruel irony. She had wished to be needed, yes, but she had wished to be needed for who she was, not for what she could provide. Being needed like this wasn't love. It was labor disguised as affection. Her throat tightened as she remembered a moment from years ago. Her oldest child, maybe 8 years old at the time, tugging on her sleeve, begging her to stay home from work because Christmas is better when you're here, Mommy. She had stayed. She had lost a shift at her job, taken a cut in pay, and spent the entire day baking cookies and watching Christmas movies, feeling grateful that her presence mattered more than any paycheck. And now, decades later, the same child, now grown, now a parent, was ready to leave her alone on Christmas without a second thought, ready to hand her 8 children and disappear onto a beach, ready to treat her like an employee instead of a mother. She wiped a tear from her cheek and felt the weight of years press into her bones. She wasn't angry that they wanted a vacation. She understood exhaustion. She understood wanting a break. She understood needing escape. She had lived those years herself. But what hurt, what truly hurt, was that they planned it around her instead of with her. They didn't say, "Mom, could we talk about an idea?" They didn't say, "Would you be up for helping us?" They didn't even say, "We know this is a lot to ask." They said nothing. They planned, they assumed, they expected. She stood up slowly, her body stiff, and walked toward the tree to plug in the remaining string of lights, but her hand paused. She wasn't sure she wanted the tree lit tonight. She wasn't sure she wanted the house to glow with the warmth of a holiday her children had stripped her out of. Instead, she let her fingers drop to her side and turned back toward the hallway, the very hallway where her heart had cracked open just hours earlier. And the worst part, she couldn't shake the words "she owes us." Owes them for what? For raising them, for giving them life, for sacrificing her dreams for theirs, for putting every ounce of her energy, money, and love into their futures. If anything, they owed her gratitude, respect, honesty. But instead, they had rewritten the narrative in their heads until she became nothing more than an extension of their needs. It made her wonder, had this been happening for years? Had they slowly stopped seeing her as a person? When did she become the one who was expected to adapt, to bend, to break while they soared freely? She walked back to the armchair and sat down, folding her hands tightly, quietly repeating to herself, "I am still a person. I am still a mother. I am still allowed to have boundaries." She knew she had a choice to make. She could say nothing and allow them to take advantage of her. She could let them drop off the kids and pretend everything was fine while she drowned in exhaustion and loneliness for 10 days. Or she could do something she hadn't done in many years. She could stand up for herself. And the mere thought of that sent a shiver through her, because the truth was she had forgotten what it felt like to put her own needs first. But something inside her, something she thought had faded long ago, flickered back to life. A strength, a resolve, a reminder that Christmas wasn't created to be endured, it was created to be shared. And this year, she would make sure they finally remembered that. She woke the next morning with the heavy, lingering weight of yesterday's revelations still pressing on her chest, the kind of ache that doesn't loosen with sleep, but instead sharpens with the clarity of daylight. She moved through the house quietly, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts of old Christmas mornings that still lived in the walls, the sound of her children waking her up at dawn, the way her late husband used to carry the youngest down the hallway like a sack of laughing potatoes, the messy, joyful chaos she thought she'd always be part of. But now the house felt colder, the silence felt harsher, and every ornament she had unpacked the day before suddenly looked like it belonged to a world that had slowly moved on without her. She tried focusing on simple things, making tea, straightening the couch pillows, checking her list of holiday groceries, but her mind kept drifting back to the words she overheard, and then to the words she didn't. Because the truth was, after she walked away yesterday, their conversation kept echoing in her head, and something inside her told her that there had been more she hadn't heard. More that might hurt, more that might explain. Or worse, more that might prove she was right to feel used. Her curiosity gnawed at her like a slow, painful tug. It wasn't the curiosity of someone nosy. It was the curiosity of someone desperate to understand why the people she raised were now speaking about her like an obligation instead of a blessing. So she did something she'd never done before. She listened again. She didn't mean to. She walked toward the kitchen that morning, and there on the table was her son's forgotten tablet still connected to a family group call, one they assumed had ended last night, one where their voices still carried through the speakers in choppy bursts. And there she heard it not once but repeatedly. 10 days won't kill her. She's lucky we're trusting her with the kids. She should be grateful we're even giving her this chance. Grateful. Grateful to be saddled with 8 energetic children for 10 days during the holidays. Grateful to clean up their spills, break up their arguments, cook their meals. Grateful to give up her quiet Christmas morning, the traditions she cherished, the memories she built with her late husband. The audacity of that word hit her so hard she had to steady herself on the countertop, her breath hitching with a mix of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. And then there was the laughter, the kind that wasn't malicious but was somehow even worse. Casual, dismissive laughter, the kind that told her they hadn't thought for even 1 second that she might have her own life, her own limitations, her own dignity. Mom doesn't go anywhere anyway, someone said, almost bored. What else would she be doing on Christmas? The implication was a knife between her ribs, that her life had shrunk so small in their eyes that the only possible use for her time was to give it to them. That she had no plans, no joy, no purpose beyond what they assigned to her. She felt her jaw clench as she remembered the years she had spent making Christmas magical for them, staying up until 2 a.m. assembling toys, baking cookies shaped like stars, dressing up as Santa's helper just to make them laugh. They hadn't forgotten those years, they had simply repurposed them. They had turned her generosity into expectation, and expectation into entitlement. She leaned closer to the tablet, not because she wanted to hear more, but because she needed to understand whether this cruelty was unanimous or if there was at least one heart in the family still beating with compassion. And that's when she heard a different voice, softer, uncertain, tense, her youngest. Guys, this isn't right, they said. Mom shouldn't be blindsided like this. She's older now. It'll be too hard. A hush fell over the voices. Then came the reply, sharp, defensive, irritated. You're just being dramatic. We've all done more for her than she's done for us anyway. She'll be fine. She's tough. Each dismissal pushed her deeper into her chair, feeling her heart shrink into something fragile and trembling. It wasn't the first time she had been called tough, like it was a justification for giving her more work. It wasn't the first time someone had said she'd be fine without asking if she truly would. But hearing them say she hadn't done enough after everything she had sacrificed was the cruelest blow of all. They didn't see the nights she worked double shifts so they could have presents. They didn't see the years she went without new clothes so they could go on school trips. They didn't see the dreams she gave up because motherhood had asked her to choose them over herself. They didn't see it, but she had lived it. Her youngest tried again. We should ask her, they said firmly. It's Christmas. She deserves to enjoy it too. The silence that followed was long, telling, painful. Then someone said, if we ask, she'll say no. Another said, exactly. That's why we're not asking. And the final voice, the one that broke her spirit just a little more, whispered, we'll just tell her last minute. She won't have time to argue. She hadn't realized she was crying until a tear fell onto her hand. They expected her to surrender. They expected her to fold, to comply, to do what she always did, put herself last, hide her pain, smile through exhaustion, and say yes because she didn't want to disappoint them. But the part that froze her, the part that made her sit down at the kitchen table with a hand pressed to her heart, came next, spoken in a hushed, almost guilty tone. Well, if something happens to her while we're gone, at least the kids will be there to help. Silence, thick, horrified. She felt her heartbeat stutter. Something happens to her. They were acknowledging her age, her fragility, her risks, but instead of caring, instead of adjusting the plan, they decided to gamble on her health. She wasn't a grandmother to them in that moment. She was a liability they hoped the grandchildren could absorb. Her breath came shallow. She looked at the half-decorated tree, the stockings still folded on the couch, the cookies she'd planned to bake later, and it all suddenly felt cheap, pointless, hollow. Christmas, in her mind, had always meant love, togetherness, family, but for them it had become an escape and she had become the means. Yet even through the heartbreak, there was one flicker of hope, her youngest. The only one with enough courage to question the plan. and she knew instinctively, undeniably, that this was the thread she would follow. Because where there is one person who still sees you, there is still a chance to be heard. But first, she needed to make a decision that would change everything, a decision she had avoided her whole life. This year, she would not be used, and when her children arrived at her doorstep expecting compliance, they would find a woman they had forgotten she was. She spent the entire day moving through her house as if drifting through someone else's life, her body performing familiar motions while her mind replayed every cruel, thoughtless word she'd heard the night before and that morning. She folded laundry that suddenly felt too heavy, stirred soup she didn't plan to eat, straightened cushions that didn't need straightening, anything to keep her hands busy, while her heart tried to make sense of why her children had decided she was little more than a convenient solution to their holiday escape. But by afternoon, she felt something stronger pushing beneath the sadness, clarity, a rising certainty that she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Her children weren't planning to include her in Christmas, they were planning to drop responsibility on her and run. And yet, something still didn't sit right. Something in their hushed tones, in the nervous laughter, in the tension she sensed beneath their entitlement. Something told her there was more to this than simple selfishness. So when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel later that evening and saw two of her children's cars pulling into her driveway, her heart jumped not with hope, but with a cold certainty that whatever they were here to say was not an apology. She didn't hide this time, she didn't retreat to give them space. Instead, she stood just inside the kitchen doorway, listening, and what she heard made her breath catch. "We need to be quick," one of them whispered. "She'll be back any minute." They thought she was out. They thought they had time. They had come early to drop off supplies, bags of groceries, suitcases, toys, enough food to feed 8 children for 10 days. "Put the snacks high," another muttered. "You know how she gets tired. If they're not constantly eating, they'll drive her crazy." She pressed a hand to her chest. They were planning everything down to the chaos they expected. They weren't just assuming she'd say yes, they were building her prison before her eyes. And the worst part, they didn't even knock. Then came the sentence that made her knees weaken. "We'll tell her in the morning." "If we tell her now, she'll argue." They were afraid of her voice, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. Because deep down, they knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew she was aging. They knew she had limits they didn't want to acknowledge. They knew she deserved rest, joy, peace, but they were hoping to outrun that guilt long enough to get to the airport. A cold wave washed over her as she listened to them unpack the groceries she never asked for. The casual betrayal stung, but beneath it she heard something else, a nervousness in her middle child's voice. I don't feel right," they murmured. "Mom seemed tired last week. Maybe we should rethink this." The room fell silent, a charged, suffocating silence. Then, "We bought the tickets already," the oldest snapped. "She'll be fine, yeah," another added. "She'd be alone for Christmas anyway." The cruelty of that assumption hit her so hard she had to grip the doorframe. Alone, alone because they stopped coming. Alone because they filled their calendars without her. Alone because they slowly erased her until loneliness became her normal. They created the emptiness and then used it to justify abandoning her. But then came the shift. Her youngest, the only one who had shown concern before, spoke again, more firmly this time. "You're all forgetting something," they said. "She's not a machine, and she's not a babysitter. She's our mother." A pause, the oldest scoffed. "Stop being dramatic," but the youngest didn't back down. "I'm serious. This is cruel. She's been acting different lately. Slower, tired. You haven't noticed because you don't visit unless you need something." The blow was sharp and true, and for once the others fell silent. She felt the sting of that truth too, because she had been slower and she had been hiding it. She didn't want to worry them. She didn't want to become a burden. She didn't want to confirm their quiet fear that she was aging. So she kept her aches to herself. But they noticed anyway, or at least one of them did. That small spark of recognition lit something inside her, something warm, something painful, something hopeful. But before she could let that feeling take root, she heard something else. something that shattered her chest open with fresh, raw disbelief. The oldest said quietly, almost guiltily, "We're not doing this forever. It's just this might be our last chance to take a big trip before things change with her health." Silence. The youngest whispered, "Why didn't we talk to her about that?" And then came the sentence she hadn't expected, the one that made the air freeze. "Because we don't know how to. Nobody wants to be the one to say Mom is getting older." Her breath stopped. Her heart thudded painfully. They weren't just using her, they were avoiding her. Avoiding a conversation they were too afraid to have. Avoiding acknowledging her aging because they didn't know how to handle it. Avoiding facing their own guilt for seeing the changes and doing nothing. And somehow, instead of talking to her, instead of supporting her, instead of loving her through it, they decided to fill her house with children as if distraction could hide the truth. She backed away from the doorway, her mind spinning, hurt tangled with clarity, anger tangled with heartbreak. But through it all, a realization rose, clear, sharp, unignorable. Her children were scared, scared of her aging, scared of responsibility, scared of losing her. And instead of drawing closer, they panicked and pushed her into the role that felt safest to them, the role she'd played her entire life, caretaker. But she wasn't their caretaker anymore. And this Christmas, she would not let them run from the truth. What she planned to do next would force them to see her, the real her, for the first time in years. She stepped back into the hallway with a steadiness she didn't feel, her heart pounding in her chest like an old clock fighting to keep time, each beat loud enough to drown out the last whispers from her children in the kitchen. She had reached the edge, the painful, trembling edge, of letting herself be used, dismissed, and handled behind her back. And something in her spirit, something fierce that had slept for years beneath layers of politeness and sacrifice, rose with a calm she hadn't felt in decades. She walked forward, placed her hand on the doorway, and pushed it open. The talking stopped instantly. Her children turned to her as if they'd seen a ghost, eyes widening, cheeks draining of color, shoulders stiffening in unison. For a moment they looked like the children they once were, caught red-handed with broken ornaments or empty cookie jars. But this time, the mess they'd created wasn't spilled milk or a cracked ornament. It was her heart. And she wasn't going to quietly sweep it up for them anymore. She didn't yell, she didn't cry. She simply said, with a voice far too soft to match the storm inside her, 10 days. Without asking me, the silence that followed was so thick she could feel it cling to her skin. Her oldest opened their mouth as if scrambling for a lie, then closed it when she raised a hand. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't insult me with excuses." She stepped fully into the kitchen, her gaze sweeping over the grocery bags, the packed snacks, the stacked suitcases, all of it placed there like she was a nanny preparing for her shift. The sight made her stomach twist, but she refused to let her children see her break. "You were going to ambush me," she said quietly. "You were going to corner me with 8 children at my door on Christmas Eve and disappear. And you weren't even going to give me the dignity of deciding for myself." Her middle child tried to step toward her, mumbling, "Mom, we thought you'd," but she held up that same firm hand again. "You thought I'd say yes because you've built your lives on me always saying yes. You thought my love meant surrender. You thought my silence meant agreement." Her voice cracked then, not from weakness, but from the unbearable truth finally finding oxygen. "You thought I didn't matter." The words hung in the air like a bell tolling in an empty church, and suddenly no one could look her in the eyes. Her youngest stared at the floor with guilt spilling from their face. The others shifted, fidgeted, swallowed hard, and for a moment she wondered if any one of them would finally say the words she needed. "We're sorry, Mom," but none did, not at first. Instead, her oldest blurted, "We didn't mean it like that. We thought it would be easier this way." She stepped closer, her calm unwavering. Easier for who? The answer was obvious, and the shame on their faces confirmed it. Easier for them. Easier for you to drop your responsibilities on me. Easier for you to avoid growing up. Easier for you to take a vacation you didn't even consider inviting me to. Her voice grew firmer, stronger. Easier to pretend I don't have needs, feelings, a life. She looked at them each, letting each moment of silence sink deep. I am not your babysitter. I am not your free labor. I am not your fallback plan. I am your mother. A tear finally slid down her cheek, but her voice didn't waver. And you will not treat me like this again. The youngest finally broke. Mom, I tried, they whispered through trembling lips. I told them this was wrong. I told them you deserved better. And for the first time all day, her heart softened. She stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on their cheek. I know you did, she whispered. And I'm grateful you saw me when the others didn't. But the relief of that moment was short-lived because her middle child suddenly blurted something that made her freeze entirely. We didn't think we'd get another chance to take a trip like this, not after your condition. The room went still, still in the way only devastating truth can make a room still. She slowly turned. My what? They exchanged glances, panicked, guilty, sharp. Her oldest swallowed hard. Mom, the doctor called. He couldn't reach you. He called us. Her breath hitched, her world narrowed. And you didn't tell me, she whispered. You heard something about my health and didn't tell me. They all began talking at once, scrambling, drowning in excuses. We didn't know how to tell you. We didn't want you to panic. We were waiting for the right moment. We thought we could make the holidays easier. She slammed her hand onto the counter, startling even herself into silence. Easier, she cried. You think hiding my own health from me makes anything easier? Tears spilled freely now, hot and enraged. You were going to abandon me with 8 children while you ran from the truth of my life changing. Their shame filled the room, thick and suffocating. And that's when the final blow came, the big reveal her youngest could no longer bear to keep hidden. Mom, they whispered, voice breaking, the doctor said you need follow-up tests soon. The kind that require someone with you. She pressed a hand to her mouth. The room felt like it tilted. They weren't avoiding telling her because they didn't care. They were avoiding telling her because they didn't know how to handle that their mother, the strong one, the reliable one, the one who never needed anything, might finally need them. That truth was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Her children weren't monsters. They were terrified adults masking fear as selfishness, but fear didn't excuse their behavior, and she refused to let it define how they treated her. She straightened, wiping her tears. I needed to know this, she said firmly, but I will not be punished for aging, and I will not be used because you're scared. She looked at each of them, letting her new resolve settle like iron in her spine. There will be no 10-day babysitting, there will be no ambush, and there will be no running from the truth. Then she said something none of them expected. Christmas will happen in my home with all of you, and you will help me. Because I am still here and I am still your mother. Her words shifted the room. The guilt, the fear, the love, all tangled together, finally broke open something honest, and what happened next would change their family forever. For a long moment after she spoke, the room felt wrapped in a stillness she hadn't felt in years. A silence thick with guilt, surprise, fear, love, and the realization that they had crossed a line they were no longer allowed to pretend they didn't see. She stood there, shoulders back, chin lifted, her breath trembling but steady, reclaiming the dignity she had slowly, quietly surrendered over the years without ever meaning to. Her children looked at her as if seeing her fully for the first time in a long time, not as the reliable safety net who would rearrange her life to make theirs easier, not as the aging woman whose boundaries could be ignored because she'd understand, but as a person with a heart that bruised, a body that tired, and a soul that still longed for connection instead of exploitation. The oldest was the first to break, sitting down heavily at the table, burying their face in their hands with a groan of remorse. Mom, we messed up, they whispered. We messed up so badly. And for the first time, she didn't rush to soothe them, didn't brush away their guilt with the automatic mercy mothers learn too early and never unlearn. She let them feel it. She let the truth settle in their bones the way it had settled painfully in hers. Her middle child moved next, stepping forward with tears gathering along their lashes. We didn't mean to treat you like this, they said, voice thick and uneven. We were scared. We didn't know how to handle the doctor calling us. She swallowed hard, keeping her gaze steady. Scared of what? She asked gently. Scared of me or scared of losing me? They crumbled at that, a sob escaping them as they admitted both. Their vulnerability cracked something inside her, something tender, something motherly, something forgiving, but she held her ground. Fear doesn't excuse disrespect, she said softly. Fear doesn't excuse secrecy. Fear doesn't excuse taking advantage of someone you love. They nodded, their tears falling freely now. And then her youngest, the only one who had tried to defend her from the start, stepped closer and wrapped their arms around her waist with a trembling sort of desperation. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have told you. I didn't want you to feel alone. I just didn't know how to speak without making everyone fight. She cradled the back of their head gently, grateful for this spark of conscience in the storm, whispering, "You saw me." "Thank you for that." The other children exchanged glances, shame woven with longing, with the sudden, gutting awareness that they had drifted too far from the values she raised them with. And slowly, one by one, they approached her, offering apologies that were shaky but real. She accepted them, but not blindly. She accepted them with the wisdom of someone who knew forgiveness meant nothing without change. "You will not leave me out of my own life again," she said. "You will not make decisions about me without me. And you will not use me because you're afraid of facing your own responsibilities." They nodded, each one quietly agreeing, their faces softening into something that resembled the children she once knew, children who used to cling to her apron strings, children who believed she could fix anything with a hug, children who once saw her as their entire world. But now she needed them to understand something new. She wasn't disappearing into the background of their lives. Not yet, not ever without a fight. She looked at the suitcases piled in the corner and the bags of groceries meant to feed 8 children for 10 days. "All of this goes back," she said firmly. "There will be no surprise drop-offs, no 10-day ambush. And as for your trip, that's up to you, but none of your plans get built on my shoulders." They nodded again, but this time the nods came with deeper breaths, as if they were finally exhaling the entitlement they'd been feeding for years. "And the doctor," she said, pressing a hand to the countertop for steadiness. "From now on, the doctor calls me, only me, and if you want to support me, you do it with honesty, not secrets." Her oldest stood and quietly said, "Mom will go with you. All of us will be there for the appointments, will help." For the first time since the conversation began, she let some softness return to her voice. "That's all I ever wanted," she said, "not for you to carry me. Just to walk beside me." And then, as if the mood couldn't shift anymore, her youngest glanced at the holiday decorations scattered half-finished around her living room. "Mom," they whispered, "why don't we stay, all of us, tonight? Help you decorate, make Christmas what you wanted it to be." The sudden warmth of that suggestion spread through her chest like a small fire reigniting in a cold hearth. She nodded. "I'd like that," she whispered. And slowly, hesitantly at first, then with growing familiarity, they all moved into the living room. Someone plugged in the lights, someone else unpacked the ornaments. The grandchildren, who'd been waiting in the car, came in with loud, bright excitement, rushing into her arms as if she'd been gone for months. And as she held them, something healed inside her, something she thought might never repair. She wasn't just the fallback, she wasn't just the caretaker. She was Grandma, the heart of the family, the memory keeper, the one whose absence left a hole none of them could ignore. They decorated together. They talked honestly for the first time in years. They laughed, cried, shared stories, apologized, promised, and slowly rebuilt a bridge that had been splintering long before this Christmas. And as she placed the star on top of the tree, her late husband's favorite tradition, she felt something settle inside her with gentle certainty. This year would not be a Christmas spent in exhaustion or resentment. It would be a Christmas of truth, of family rediscovered, of boundaries respected, of love earned, not assumed. And when she finally stepped back to admire the tree, her children standing beside her with softened eyes and humbled hearts, she whispered a quiet truth meant only for herself. "You remembered me, and now I remember me too."